The book that I'm going to be talking about today is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, and it's a Bildren's Roman, which is simply just a story of becoming, a story of growing up and learning who you are, and that's exactly what Jane Eyre is. Charlotte tells the story of a little girl becoming a woman and learning all of these things throughout her life. And so some of the things that I wanted to talk about in this reflection or PowerPoint is the personal development that Jane undergoes on her journey, the realizations and lessons that Jane learns on her journey, and just the overall satisfaction of her journey, not only from Jane's standpoint or Charlotte Bronte's standpoint, but also the satisfaction of a reader as someone who's experiencing the journey in a third person. So just talking about the personal development that she undergoes, Jane begins her journey very dramatic. She's questioning everything about her life, why the things are the way that they are, and at her lowest moment she begins to question her misfortune, and she says, "Why was I always suffering, always browbeaten, always accused, forever condemned? Why could I never please? Why was it useless to try to win anyone's favor?" And although this sounds very dramatic, Jane was a young girl, and to her, the things that were happening to her were the worst thing that could be happening to her. And yes, they were horrible situations. She was being abused, she wasn't loved, she wasn't being taken care of, and this was her way of expressing those things. And as she was learning how to express, she actually verbalized some of these feelings to her caretaker, Mrs. Reed, and I think this brought her personal development from being internalized to being externalized. As she goes up to Miss Reed, she says, "I am not deceitful. If I were, I should have said that I loved you, but I declare I do not love you. I dislike you, the worst of anybody in the world except John Reed. And this book about the liar you may give to your girl Georgiana, for it is she who tells lies and not I." So in this moment, we see this little bit of courage rising up in Jane, but it almost comes off as sassy and fiery and disrespectful. And so the things that she learns as she goes to school and gets outside of her sphere of influence actually help her along her journey into becoming a woman and becoming respectful, because she learns from her friend Helen and from Miss Temple and from some of the other people at the school. But one of the big things that she learns is what I like to call the doctrine of endurance. So Jane is imagining what she would do in a situation of discipline. She just saw Helen being disciplined and stood up in front of the whole school, and she was saying that she would feel ashamed and embarrassed and she would hit somebody. But Helen says that it is far better to endure patiently a smart whose nobody feels but yourself than to commit a hasty action whose evil consequences will extend to all connected with you. And besides, the Bible bids us return good for evil. And this is kind of fascinating because you see this go throughout her story, because just a few chapters later, Jane is punished almost in the same way that Helen is. She's made to stand up on a stool, and Mr. Brocklehurst tells the entire school that she's a liar, and he accuses Jane of being a liar and tells the school all these horrible lies about Jane, and she has to endure the punishment. And she brings to mind all the things that Helen told her, that she must turn the other cheek and act as Christ would act and return good for evil. And it says that as she's standing up on the stool, this is a quote from that. It says, "There was I, then, mounted aloft, I, who had said I could not bear the shame of standing on my natural feet in the middle room, was now exposed to general view on a pedestal of infamy. What my sensations were, no language can describe, but just they all arose, stifling my breath and constricting my throat. A girl came up and passed me. In passing, she lifted her eyes. What a strange light inspired them! What an extraordinary sensation that ray sent through me! How the new feeling bore me up! It was as if I, a martyr, a hero, had passed a slave or victim, and imparted strength in the transit. And this girl that passed her was Helen, her friend that had taught her these things about endurance. And I think this was kind of the ending of her development in the school. So she came in this dramatic, woe is me attitude, and she was able to learn endurance and courage from her friend. And I think that this was a peak in her development because it carried into the rest of her journey as she became a teacher at the school and a governess. Like, she learned courage and endurance and learned all of these things, and they are only the beginning of her story. So the reader already sees all of this personal development in her, but now she takes this and it goes into the rest of her life. So I think some of the realizations and the lessons that Jane learns along her journey kind of go along with her personal development. So the first one of the realizations and lessons, I think, is that she learns that she's courageous, like we just talked about on page 64. Another one that she learns is that she's capable. So Jane had been taught when she was a child that she couldn't do anything. She was told she was worthless and that she couldn't succeed by her aunt and her cousins, but then she stays in the school for 6 years and ends up teaching in the school for 2 years, and then she goes on to be the governess in the home of Mr. Rochester. So regardless of what's been spoken over her, she learns that she's capable. She also learns self-worth. So she was in love with Mr. Rochester. They were supposed to be married, and they were both in love with each other, but when she discovers her and Mr. Rochester's secret marriage, she refuses to marry him. She's not willing to have a dishonorable marriage just for the sake of this love that she thought she had. She understands that she's worth more than that and that she can't do that to herself or to Mr. Rochester. And so she ends up leaving and doesn't come back until later on, when she discovers that Mr. Rochester's wife has died in a fire. She comes back and she cares for him, and they end up getting married. But I think this is kind of another big lesson, that she deserves to have love. So even though her self-worth pushed the love off for a little bit, in the end she did deserve to be loved. Because I think growing up, she didn't feel loved all the time. That there was bits and pieces of people with Helen and Miss Temple and Bessie that showed her love, but it was Mr. Rochester that showed her romantic love. And because of her self-worth, she was willing to put that off until it was the right time, until it was honorable, and then she ended up marrying him, and they lived happily ever after. So I think the overall satisfaction, I actually found her story very intense and sad, but I was always intrigued by it. I think that it carried a continually relevant storyline, so a reader can read this and pick out pieces that maybe they could apply to their own life, whether they've been through abusive situations or bullying, or maybe they had family members who passed away or friends who passed away. Maybe they had to skip on a love and come back to it. I think that it's something that anybody who has lived life may have experienced something that Jane's experienced. And I think because of that, it makes it genuine. So I think some of the raw qualities and the genuine characteristics that kind of come along in Jane's story bring satisfaction not only to Jane and her life, so she's experiencing these raw emotions, but I think that for the reader in that time, it was the romanticism thing that it was raw emotion rather than made up fairy tales, that it made people feel and think, and the poetic feelings of real life happening really draws in the reader, and it makes Jane feel like a real character. So I feel as though Jane began as this scared, dramatic girl and ended as a woman who was in love and taking care of people. and willing to admit to herself and to those around her that she was important and that she was willing to be cared for, that she should be cared for, and that she can care for others.